This romance was a new chapter for him, an opportunity to live a youthful life with someone that's very beautiful.
They were headed back to Southern California to celebrate their first Thanksgiving together.
The smell coming out of the bag is not something you can describe.
So the coroner investigator comes out, and he said, "This is a human."
And the lifestyle that she thought she was going to live was all a lie.
Things started to fall apart a little bit.
She wanted payback.
I did all this in 2 hours. Shut him up.
That's strange. And not only strange, that is insane.
I couldn't believe I did what I did.
In the city of Costa Mesa, the California dream is alive and well.
Costa Mesa is a relatively small town, and it is sunny all the time. A lot of people will settle in Costa Mesa because they can be so close to the beach without having to buy really expensive property.
It's around 2 p.m. on December 1st, 1991, when Costa Mesa resident Jose Escoval calls 911. He tells the operator of a concerning interaction he just had with his ex-girlfriend.
Jose receives a knock on his door.
He did look out the window and see a red Corvette in his driveway. Didn't recognize the car. He opened the door, and it was a former girlfriend, somebody that had lived with him on and off. He'd broken up a year ago, but still maintained a relationship. She was very disheveled, very upset, had gloves on her hands, wanted his help. So he invited her into the apartment, and she sat down and basically told him she wanted to elicit his help, his car, to get rid of her husband's body.
He says, "Hold on, just stay right there."
As soon as he was able to get out of her presence, he went straight to a payphone to call the police and say, "Hey, I need some help."
He identifies the woman as Omaima Nelson. Her husband's name is Bill.
Police dispatchers told him to stay put. An officer would meet with him very soon.
Born in 1935 and raised in Texas, Bill Nelson left a big impression.
Bill was a flamboyant kind of a man. He drove a red Corvette.
He was a dyed-in-the-wool Texan, known for his red cowboy boots and big belt buckles, and gregarious personality, fun to be around, liked to engage people, had a very bubbly personality, told tall tales and things of that nature.
This guy was larger than life in more ways than one. I mean, we're talking 6'4", 230 pounds, wearing red cowboy boots and a red hat. And many people, they took to Bill.
Bill Nelson had several wives, and he had kids with those wives, and he had grandkids with those kids. His first wife, I believe they lived in Florida, and his second wife in Texas, his third wife in Texas.
To earn a living, Bill was a jack of all trades.
Bill Nelson was a pilot. He crop dusted. He had a knowledge of computers to the point where he could take old ones apart and reassemble them and then at some point sell them. He also worked for a mortgage company.
By the early 90s, Bill was living in California. In the fall of 1991, he met a beautiful young woman who was also half his age.
One night at the pool hall, Omaima, she walks in, just kind of perusing the place. He said, "Who is that? Those high cheekbones, that beautiful hair?" She was this Egyptian goddess, and he wanted to know more. Omaima was born in southern Egypt along the Nile River, kind of near the Sudanese border, and she was really born into a village that was really poor.
Omaima was raised in a Muslim household. She was devout. She met a oil worker while she was back in Egypt, and they started a relationship. When her mother heard that the relationship was getting kind of serious, she insisted that they get married. And at some point after the marriage, he was called back to Houston, Texas, and she accompanied him.
Around age 18, Omaima is faced with the possibility of the American dream, to live a totally different life. When she arrived, she spoke minimal English. Imagine being in a country where you are not able to stand up for yourself, you're not able to communicate your basic needs outside of your partner, you rely on him for everything.
He turned out to be a violent man. So she became a battered woman at 18 here in America. She managed to get help from a battered women's shelter and get away from him.
In 1987, Omaima left Texas and headed for California.
After divorcing her first husband, she moved in with her sister in San Clemente, California, located south of Costa Mesa. And she took up several jobs, one of which was being a model at some lingerie place in the mall.
She was a beautiful, beautiful woman with high cheekbones and, people would look her way. But the money wasn't coming in fast enough. She wanted more. She was attracted to these older men. To her, they provided protection, they provided stability, and they provided money.
Omaima had the belief that if she found a nice older man, that man would both take care of her and be kind.
And at 23 years old, Omaima met 56-year-old Bill Nelson at a bar.
She sees a big old statuesque guy. He was commanding the entire room, telling his stories, had everybody captivated.
Bill wooed Omaima with his cowboy persona and promises of a better life.
He may have mentioned that he, lived a lavish life, had a red Corvette, may have even owned a cattle ranch.
For Mr. Nelson, I imagine this romance was a new chapter for him, an opportunity to live a young, joyful, youthful life with someone that's very beautiful.
Once Omaima and Bill Nelson met each other, they were inseparable for days at a time, even a couple of weeks before he decided, you know what, I want you to meet my family. So they took a road trip to Arkansas and Texas, and that's where his family was. And on that trip, they made a big decision. He made the decision to propose to her, and not just propose, but within a day, it's time to get married.
And he drove to Phoenix, Arizona, where a justice of the peace married him.
The newlyweds continued their road trip, sharing the good news with Bill's family.
Omaima was elated. She finally found a family that she felt like she gelled with. She really felt this sense of belonging thanks to Bill, her new husband.
Following the road trip, the couple looked forward to spending the holidays together.
They were headed back to Southern California to celebrate their first Thanksgiving together.
But 3 days after Thanksgiving, Omaima's ex, Jose Escobar, calls 911 to report that Omaima showed up at his doorstep, asking him to help move Bill's body.
Police dispatchers told him to stay put, that they'd have officers running over to his house on Monte Vista, but an officer would meet with him very soon.
While Jose waits at the payphone, officers head to his home.
When police get to Joel's residence, Omaima's inside. And one of the officers goes inside to speak with her, start asking her some questions.
She's dressed all in black. She's got a black blazer on, black pants, even black leather gloves on her hands.
When asked about her husband, Omaima says he is out of town.
He'd spent Thanksgiving with her on Thursday, and on Friday he'd left for a business trip, and she expected him back the following Friday. Asked her kind of the circumstances around her connection to Jose, and she said she'd known him, past boyfriend. She'd come over to see if she could stay there because Bill was gone.
There was another police officer, a couple of them outside, and that's when they spotted that red Corvette.
We looked inside the Corvette. Officer Hogue spotted a 50-gallon trash bag, which was tied at the top, sitting on the front seat. So Officer Hogue removed it and set it down on the front yard grass and cut it open with a penknife. The smell is not something you can describe.
On December 1st, 1991, a bizarre scene is unfolding at a home in Costa Mesa, California.
Parked out front of the location was a Corvette, and Officer Hogue looked inside and saw a big trash bag that was tied at the top, sitting in plain view. Then Officer Hogue cut the bag open with a penknife he had. At that point, we could see a liquid substance in the bag, and the smell that was emanating from the bag was so powerful.
Meanwhile, officers find the homeowner, Jose Escoval, at a nearby payphone. Jose explains what prompted him to call 911.
About 2 in the afternoon, somebody was knocking on the door, and he looked out, saw the red Corvette, opened the door, and it was Omaima. She removed the black gloves that she was wearing. He saw that her hands had been cut with what looked like a knife. She had bruises on her arms, on her legs, so he invited her into the apartment.
She says, I need your help. Jose says, with what? She tells him that her husband attacked her, and she ended up killing him.
She killed him, cut him up. She had a trash bag in the car right now and would pay him a huge sum of money if he would just help her.
I just need to move his body. And then she offers him $75,000 and 2 motorcycles if he actually obliges. He says, hold on, just stay right there.
Jose left the house and found a payphone and called 911.
Back at Jose's house, a grim discovery is underway.
The whole show was this bag that was in the back of the Corvette. One of the officers had taken the bag out of the car, opened it up. I look inside the bag, and I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. It just looks kind of nasty. I said, you know, this could be pig entrails for all I know. The thing that went through my mind, I need to identify this as human. Because I'm still thinking, this is some kind of gag. This is some kind of misdirection of some sort. I'm just still not believing that this is human internal parts that are in this bag. So we're going to need a coroner out here. So the coroner investigator comes out. We opened up a big plastic cloth to the ground, and we got the remains out onto the cloth. And then all of a sudden he says, hey, you better look at this. I go, what? He says, do you know what those little black spots on this organ is? I said, I got no idea what that is. He said, that's carbon. I said, it is? He said, yeah. I said, you know where that comes from? I said, no. He said, it comes from smoking. And he said, so unless you know any pigs that smoke, this is a human.
Investigators turn to Omaima.
We introduced ourselves, said obviously we don't want to really be talking out here on the street. Would you mind accompanying us to the police department for an interview? And she agreed.
But law enforcement has another priority before they talk to Omaima.
We were able to determine from her identification where she lived with her husband.
Officers immediately went over to that apartment to see if there was, somebody in distress, somebody hurt.
It was locked. We obtained a key from the manager. I decided we had exigent circumstances to enter the apartment to see if there was someone inside that was injured and needed medical assistance. Upon entering the apartment, we instantly ascertained that nothing was amiss in the living room. Nothing seemed out of place. Upon entering the bedroom, Officer Hogan and I entered together, and we saw blood spots on the side of a mattress. We then walked back out of the bedroom and entered the kitchen area, which was a mess. Sitting on the counter was a crock pot. There was a lot of dishes in the sink and on the countertop. And for some reason, I decided to open the top freezer door of the refrigerator, and I saw this round object in foil. And I tapped on it with my finger and said to Officer Hogue, "Hey, Danny, I wonder if this is his head or side of ham."
Officers with the Costa Mesa Police Department make troubling discoveries inside the home of Omaima and Bill Nelson.
We saw blood spots on the side of the mattress.
They go to the freezer, open it up, big ball of aluminum foil.
We had the right, upon entering the apartment under exigent circumstances, to look to see what's in plain sight or even in a closet. But we would need a search warrant to get back into the apartment and to make a detailed search.
As they wait for the warrant to come through, investigators conduct an interview with Omaima.
We got to the station and escorted her to an interview room. She wanted a cigarette. It was obvious that she was distressed. She was talking a mile a minute. She had cuts and bruises all over her.
I had fighting blood.
What happened?
Well, I went for a drink and two girls fight with me there, and they got scratched.
Where's Bill away right now? Is he here in town, or is he out of town, or where is he?
He's out of town.
Did you tell Jose today that you killed your husband?
No, I did not.
What do you know about the garbage sack that was in your car?
Well, what is it?
Well, I'm asking you. What do you know about it?
I didn't know nothing about it.
Don't know anything about it? Oh.
Omaima offers an explanation.
She said Jose had, under false pretext, wanted to drive the red Corvette, had left for an hour, and when he came back, that bag must have been in it. So Jose must have put the bag in the car. Then she said she'd been to a laundromat doing laundry earlier in the day and decided to walk next door to a bar, but left her car unlocked. And during that time, somebody must have put a bag behind the front passenger seat. She didn't know anything about it. It would go from one extreme to the other. It was very non-cogent.
The interview goes on, and Omaima's story continues to change.
And then at some point she said that Bill had raped her.
He went tied me up. And then no one tied me up
What did he tie you to?
to the bed.
Did you kill Bill because he did this to you? Tell him the truth of it.
I didn't burn.
Just after 10 p.m., the interview ends, as Omaima is escorted to the hospital for a physical examination.
A search warrant was granted for the premises, and I responded over to serve the search warrant at about 2 a.m.
Investigators start in the bedroom, where the patrol officer spotted blood.
Next to what I presume was Bill's side of the bed were a pair of red cowboy boots and some boot shining materials on a rug. To the first eye, it looks okay.
The bed was made, mattress was on top. You lift the mattress and the blood was underneath it.
It's saturated with blood and the box spring. And then you realize that there was a headboard at one point on that bed, but the headboard was broken into several pieces and it was stashed behind the head of the bed. Did a search of the closet. small steam iron in the corner of the closet was broken. The handle was broken off of it. Wrapped up in newspaper in the closet was also a porcelain lamp that had been broken, and a crushed lampshade.
Investigators moved to the living room.
There was boxes piled up, computer parts piled up, laying around.
We saw that most all of these boxes contained trash bags, and in those trash bags were other trash bags, and in those trash bags were what appeared to be human body parts.
The disturbing scene becomes even more troubling.
We did find a box that had 2 human hands in it. It was obvious that the hands were cooked. They looked to be fried or something. Detectives were searching the kitchen, and officers started going through the refrigerator, the freezer.
They locate the large item wrapped in foil.
Take that out, open it up. It looked like a human head. I mean, that looked like a prop out of a horror movie, is what it looked like.
And also wrapped in a piece of tinfoil were genitals, male genitals. The genitals appeared as if they'd also been cooked and wrapped in tinfoil.
This is a house of horrors. It was pretty shocking.
Investigators question whether Omaima is physically capable of such violence.
The thing for me is she's petite, and I knew from Mr. Nelson's driver's license that he was, over 6 foot, 250 pounds. But in one particular box, in amongst the trash bags, were a pair of human legs, and those legs had ligature marks around the ankles. At the foot of the bed was a wicker clothes hamper full of dirty clothes, and in amongst those clothes were what appeared to be bloody garments. There was a necktie, men's necktie that was tied like a ligature. There was a section of rope that had some knots in it that appeared to be a ligature.
She says that Bill tied her to a bed, but Bill was the one with ligature marks. So everything she was saying was a lie.
On the morning of December 2nd, 1991, Omaima Nelson returns to the Costa Mesa police station following an examination at a local hospital. She is met with handcuffs.
Well, I'm going to be placing you under arrest at this time.
Why?
For suspicion of murder.
I didn't kill him.
I remember driving with my partner down to the coroner's office to witness the autopsy. We get to the coroner's office, and the watch commander calls and says, "Hey, Omaima wants to talk to you again."
Just tell me what you want to tell me and I'll listen.
I think I just killed him unconscious.
You think you killed him unconscious?
Yeah, because he did this to me, and I was kind of, I couldn't believe I did what I did.
Omaima claimed that her husband became physically abusive shortly after the wedding. She told police that she began to cope with the abuse through drinking alcohol and using drugs. During this time, she also told them that she started having visual hallucinations and auditory hallucinations telling her to murder her husband.
So all I remember that I hit him to self-defense or something.
How did you hit him?
I think I hit him with an arm or something to get off me.
How did you kill him?
I don't remember how I killed him.
Omaima does remember bits of the gory events that followed.
I did all this in 2 hours. Chopped him up pieces in 2 hours.
Chopped you up? Bill in 2 hours?
Yeah. And all I remember that his head was flying from his body, hit the ceiling up there, and made a blood in the ceiling. And I fall asleep, and I get up in the morning, and I found the trash bags, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what happened.
She said that she heard voices. The Egyptian gods were helping her, telling her things.
She was telling me that who killed, he must die. Who killed, he killed. And she turned around and she walked away. The next when I get up, I checked, I find my name and his name was written by blood in the mirror. It said, me and you.
What was written in blood?
Me and you.
Did you cook some parts of Bill before you wrapped him up in the plastic?
No, I'm not really eater much either. I don't eat meat.
You don't eat meat?
No, I don't eat red meat.
You're a vegetarian?
Vegetarian, yes.
She would go from voices, I'm hearing people from the dead telling me these things, and Bill's head's here, and he's cut up, and there's body parts all over this place. She didn't really confess to anything other than she blacked out, she heard voices, there was a phone call, somebody said, look in the freezer, look in the trash bags. It didn't make any sense. There's no continuity to this thing. She was all over the map.
Well, I think you're telling me part of the truth, but not all of it.
Well, I think I need to talk to the psychiatrist to just see the rest of my life.
We kind of sized her up as somebody that was just grasping at straws, trying to work herself out of this bad situation.
Following the interrogation, investigators get word that the coroner has positively identified the remains as Bill Nelson.
The coroner's office made a notification to next of kin. Bill's wife in Santa Maria, California was notified. He also had a son in Los Angeles.
I hate it for the family that has to even live through this because it's horrible. And truly, it is your worst nightmare.
Following her arrest, Omaima meets with multiple mental health professionals. Her story changes again and takes a shocking turn.
She was also able to provide gruesome details about the things that she did to her husband. Some of these details include dismembering her husband, boiling her husband, deep frying parts of his body.
She talked about cooking her husband, that his ribs tasted sweet. She put barbecue sauce on them and things of that nature.
That's strange. And not only strange, that is insane.
Investigators consider whether Omaima is telling the truth or setting up her defense.
It was really hard to believe that that happened. It really was.
Like one line, she was trying to say self-defense. The other line, she was trying to say criminal insanity.
It was obvious that she would throw things out and see what stuck.
Omaima's attorneys hire their own expert. In interviews, Dr. Nancy Kaiser-Boyd delves into Omaima's upbringing in Egypt.
She had a terrible childhood. She'd been sexually assaulted. Her father often beat her, and her stepmother there beat her also.
In addition to her stressful home environment, she lived in a culture during a time where female circumcision was very popular, and so this is something that she experienced very young, at 7 years old.
They took her to a dark place. She remembered it was 3 older women. Her mother wasn't there. She thought they were killing her. She described extraordinary pain and fear, and then she became unconscious. She didn't wake until her mother came and touched her. And by that time, she told me that they were preparing for her burial because they thought she was dead.
Omaima Nelson is behind bars, accused of brutally dismembering her husband of just a few weeks. In interviews with a psychologist, Omaima reveals she suffered sexual abuse, violence, and female circumcision.
We had her examined by a gynecologist, and that doctor told us that her vaginal area had a lot of scar tissue and that sex would be very painful for her.
During the trial prep, Omaima's defense team, her attorney and investigator, actually flew to this suburb of Cairo and did in-depth interviews of her family members and to kind of give a glimpse of her childhood growing up and possibly the abuses involved, to show that she'd had a series of dominating males in her life and that she'd experienced not only the circumcision but sexual assault. And so there was definitely some aspects of her past that they were trying to show contributed to this murder.
Detectives and prosecutors prepare to counter whatever defense Omaima brings to court. They speak with medical professionals who examined Omaima on the day of her arrest.
The hospital report concluded that there were no signs of rape or sexual assault.
She also mentioned that she was the one who had been held down and tied to this bedpost. No ligature marks at all around her wrists or her ankles. In fact, medical professionals said she had cuts on her, cuts that came from when she was stabbing Bill.
Investigators reach out to Bill's family, including his ex-wives.
Bill was very acquainted with family and his children. His kids would call him on a fairly regular basis, and yeah, he was just a great dad.
When I spoke to Bill's ex-wife, she spoke very fondly of Bill. And I was struck at one point that she really liked this guy. And she was deeply hurt by what happened to him.
In talking to the family, it was obvious that Bill Nelson was not a violent person. No evidence of that.
Investigators find no record of violence or abuse on Bill's behalf. Omaima is a different story.
One incident included her going to the pharmacy and grabbing whatever she wanted out of there and stealing without paying for this stuff. 2 security guards were watching her, and when they tried to stop her, she got extremely violent with them, so much so she ended up attacking them so viciously that she bit the chest of one of the women, the female security guards. She bit her breast so hard that she almost bit it off, and she also grabbed the vagina of the security guard as well.
As news of the gruesome crime spreads across the state, law enforcement gets a phone call.
Robert Hansen saw the news report of Omaima's crimes against Bill Nelson.
Mr. Robert Hansen, elderly, single, lived in an apartment, fairly successful business person. He met Omaima in a bar, and over conversation, one thing led to another, and she went home with him. Obviously, there was a relationship that started.
At one point during their relationship, they were having sex, and they were doing what she likes to call kinky sex.
She gets over there and ties him up, but instead of doing the kinky sexual thing that she promised, she attempted to rob him and pulls a gun on him. The defendant didn't tie the restraints tight enough because Robert was able to get free and escape from her. But he was so embarrassed that he never called the police. But once he saw the report in the news of Bill Nelson, he had to come forward. He couldn't keep silent because she had done something similar to him and he survived. So this wasn't Omaima's first rodeo.
Over a year after the grisly discovery of Bill Nelson's body, his wife, Omaima, is set to stand trial.
When the case goes to trial, December 1992, prosecutors immediately try to paint Omaima as this woman who wanted this lavish lifestyle that she was promised by Bill Nelson, and she was entitled to get this lifestyle.
Omaima Nelson was an ex-model, beautiful woman of Egyptian descent, very attractive, and she would seek out older men to fleece them for their money.
Bill was talking about being wealthy and owning a cattle ranch and having money, which fit right into what she was looking for. She was looking for another sugar daddy.
Following their whirlwind romance and wedding, a different truth emerged.
Things started to fall apart a little bit. She realized that Bill wasn't the man that he might be saying he is. He didn't have that cattle ranch. It became real to her that Bill had purported himself to be something other than he was.
The things that Bill promised her and the lifestyle that she thought she was going to live was all a lie. Bill didn't have any money, and she wanted payback.
On Thanksgiving Day, tensions were high, and Mr. Nelson found himself tied to a bed.
She immobilized him under a false pretext. Probably hit him with the iron. Several times, about 30 times. The iron broke during this assault. Lamp was used, also broken. And then he was stabbed too. And then started cutting him up.
From November 28th till December 1st, she completely destroyed her husband's body.
Next door neighbor, when he interviewed him, he said he was able to hear through their common wall chopping and the sink running and the garbage disposal running, to the point where he believed that the garbage disposal had given up. This activity went on through the early morning hours, quite prolonged.
Prosecutors also call Robert Hansen to the stand.
So Robert's story shows the defendant's modus operandi, and he became a star witness in the prosecution's case against her, showing that she had previously tried to do this to someone else.
Omima's attorneys do not attempt an insanity plea.
Her lawyer argued that this was self-defense or imperfect self-defense, which is a sudden belief that you need to defend yourself by killing the other person.
Dr. Kaiser Boyd takes the stand.
What she told me was that he had her tied to the bed, and he was sitting on top of her, and he was angry, and he had his pocket knife out, and he was cutting her on the breasts. And she, as you can imagine, cutting is a trigger for someone who's had genital circumcision, so she flipped out. And she got loose, and she started hitting him with a lamp by the bed. She jumped up and grabbed an iron that was in the room. And started beating him with that. She said he fell on the bed, and she stabbed him with scissors. She cut him up because she didn't want him to be able to enter the afterlife. The reason Egyptians wrapped their dead and mummified them was so they could enter heaven whole. She told me she hoped if she got to heaven, she would never see him there.
Omima took the stand herself to testify in this case. And she began to share with them in a very emotional, heartfelt testimony about, first of all, her life and the continuous abuse and the trauma and the pain.
She was a victim of sexual assault, of child abuse, of female genital mutilation, and all of this trauma, cumulatively over the years, contributed to her psychological stressors that caused her to do this.
The jury deliberates for 6 days.
I was on needles and pins. I didn't know what the outcome would be.
Ultimately, they came and found her guilty with second-degree murder, and she received 25 years to life.
But Omima's story doesn't end with the verdict.
While in prison, Omima meets another older gentleman that's rich. And that relationship began to flourish. They became married. However, during the marriage, her husband dies, but he also leaves her with a lot of money. And now she's up for parole in 2026, and she may get her dream to finally live the American dream.
The life that she lived was brutal, and it's very clear to me that it followed her everywhere that she went.
I understand her anger. However, it does not justify the gruesome, horrible, horrific crime that she committed. She doesn't deserve to be free. I don't think you can rehabilitate evil.
It was a clear morning over the North Atlantic when Air India Flight 182, a Boeing 747 carrying 329 souls, disappeared from the sky in a way that defied comprehension. And for those who would later study the wreckage, the question was not just what happened, but how something so carefully planned could erase an entire aircraft mid-flight without warning, without distress call, without a single second for anyone on board to understand they were already gone. The flight had departed from Montreal. In Canada, a city quietly connected to the lives of hundreds of passengers who were not tourists or strangers to each other but families, immigrants, students, parents returning to India or visiting loved ones after years of separation. Most of them Canadian citizens of Indian origin who had built lives in places like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, and as the aircraft climbed steadily across the Atlantic, everything appeared routine, almost boring in the way aviation professionals rely on. Boredom to mean safety, yet at 31,000 feet over the coast of Ireland, that illusion shattered in an instant when a concealed explosive device detonated inside the forward baggage compartment, tearing through the fuselage with such force that the aircraft did not simply break apart but disintegrated in midair, scattering debris across the ocean in a widening field that would later challenge search and recovery teams for months. There was no mayday call, no frantic transmission from the cockpit. No gradual descent into disaster, only a single catastrophic moment at 8:13 a.m. local time when the sky itself seemed to open and swallow the plane whole, killing all 329 passengers and crew instantly, and even before investigators could fully process the scale of that loss. A second explosion occurred on the same morning, thousands of kilometers away at Tokyo Narita Airport, where another piece of luggage connected to the same Air India network detonated in a baggage handling area, killing an airport worker and confirming that what had just occurred was not an isolated tragedy, but a coordinated act of terror spanning continents, timed with precision, designed to exploit the invisible pathways of global aviation. In the immediate aftermath, confusion ruled every level of response. From Irish air traffic controllers scanning empty radar screens to Canadian authorities in Ottawa trying to reconcile passenger manifests with intelligence warnings that had already been circulating in fragmented form, because what slowly emerged was a chilling pattern. This was not a mechanical failure, not a pilot error, not an accident born of misfortune, but an intentional mass casualty attack executed through luggage routing systems that connected Montreal, Toronto, London, and beyond, exposing vulnerabilities in international aviation security that, until that morning, few had imagined could be weaponized on such a scale. As wreckage began to wash up off the coast of Ireland, fishermen and naval crews recovered fragments of aluminum twisted like paper, personal belongings floating in salt water, and pieces of the aircraft that told a story of sudden violence frozen in time, while investigators from Canada, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and India began assembling a timeline that would take decades to complete. Each fragment of evidence pointing toward a network of individuals motivated not by profit or personal grievance alone, but by ideology rooted in political and religious extremism, specifically tied to factions within the Sikh separatist movement that had been radicalized in the aftermath of the 1984 military operation at the Golden Temple in Amritsar. A traumatic event that reverberated across diaspora communities and fueled anger, grief, and in some cases, violent retaliation. At the center of the emerging investigation were names that would become synonymous with one of the most complex terror cases in Canadian history, including Talwinder Singh Parmar, alleged leader of the Babar Khalsa extremist group, and Inderjit Singh Riyat, a man later identified as a key figure in the construction of the explosive devices, though the path to establishing their roles was anything but straightforward, as the investigation was hampered from the beginning by jurisdictional fragmentation, intelligence failures, and a lack of coordination between agencies that possessed pieces of the puzzle but failed to assemble them in time. What made the tragedy even more haunting was the realization that warning signs may have existed in advance, scattered across intelligence reports and surveillance notes that suggested suspicious baggage activity linked to individuals under watch, yet those warnings did not translate into decisive action. allowing luggage containing explosive devices to pass through airport systems in Canada and be loaded onto commercial flights carrying hundreds of unsuspecting passengers. A breakdown that would later be scrutinized in public inquiries and become a defining example of systemic failure in aviation security. For the families of the victims, however, the technical explanations offered little comfort, as they were left with photographs, unanswered phone calls, and the sudden absence of loved ones who had boarded a plane expecting an ordinary journey. And among those families were stories that would later be told in hearings and memorials. Stories of parents traveling to see children, of young professionals returning home, of couples building lives between two continents, all of whom vanished in a moment that lasted less than a second but echoed for decades. In the days following the disaster, Canadian authorities faced mounting pressure, as it became clear that the bombing had not only killed more citizens than any aviation disaster involving Canada, but had also exposed deep flaws in how intelligence warnings were handled, particularly in relation to baggage screening and passenger profiling. And, as investigators began reconstructing the chain of custody for the luggage, they discovered that at least one of the explosive devices had been intended to detonate on another Air India flight, designated Air India Flight 301, but instead exploded prematurely at Tokyo Narita Airport, killing a baggage handler and revealing the breadth of the coordinated plan. This detail alone transformed the case from a single aircraft disaster into a multi-location terrorist operation, suggesting meticulous planning, synchronization across international airports, and an intent to maximize casualties while complicating investigative response. And yet, despite the growing clarity about the method, the question of accountability remained painfully elusive. Years passed as investigators followed leads that led across continents, interviewing witnesses who sometimes disappeared or refused to cooperate, tracking financial and travel records that raised more questions than answers, and navigating political sensitivities within diaspora communities where fear of reprisal discouraged open testimony, while at the same time forensic experts painstakingly analyzed fragments of wiring, explosive residues, and baggage routing tags that slowly revealed how the bombs had been constructed and transported. The psychological profile of those involved, as it would later be reconstructed, pointed toward a worldview shaped by grievance and retaliation, where the bombing was rationalized as a form of political justice in response to perceived atrocities. Yet for investigators and survivors alike, such explanations never bridged the moral gap between ideology and the reality of 329 lives lost in seconds. Within Canada itself, the aftermath reshaped public discourse on national security, immigration, and multicultural relations, as suspicion and grief intertwined in ways that affected Sikh communities across the country, many of whom condemned the violence but still found themselves subject to scrutiny and discrimination in the years that followed, a painful secondary consequence of the attack that added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating event. Despite the scale of the investigation, which became one of the longest and most expensive in Canadian history, culminating only after more than 2 decades of legal proceedings and public inquiry reports, justice remained partial at best, with only one major conviction secured against Inderjit Singh Riyat for his role in constructing the devices, while alleged masterminds were never successfully prosecuted in court due to a combination of evidentiary gaps, witness intimidation, and deaths occurring before trial, leaving a lingering sense of unresolved accountability. And yet, even as the legal system struggled, the memory of the victims was preserved through memorials erected in cities such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Ottawa, where families gathered each year not only to mourn but to affirm that the lives lost over the Atlantic on that summer morning would not be forgotten. And in those gatherings, the story of Air India Flight 182 became more than a case file or an intelligence report. It became a reminder of how fragile modern systems of travel and security can be when confronted with determined extremism, and how the consequences of political violence extend far beyond the moment of impact, shaping communities, policies, and generations of grief that continue long after the wreckage has been cleared from the ocean floor. Long before Flight 182 ever left the runway in Montreal, the world it moved through was already carrying invisible fractures, and to understand the tragedy that would later unfold over the Atlantic, one has to step back into the atmosphere of the early 1980s, where geopolitical tension, migration, and unresolved conflict were quietly reshaping communities across continents. Canada at that time was experiencing a significant transformation, becoming home to growing South Asian immigrant Populations, particularly Sikh families who had arrived seeking stability, work, and a future far removed from the political violence of Punjab, India. Yet even in Canada, far from the fields and cities they had left behind, the emotional and political aftershocks of events in India continued to echo, especially after the 1984 military operation at the Golden Temple in Amritsar, an event that became a turning point for Sikh diaspora identity worldwide, generating grief, anger, and in some cases, radicalization among fringe elements who interpreted the event not only as a political assault, but as a personal and religious wound that demanded response. Within this charged atmosphere, Canada was both a refuge and, unknowingly, a stage where international conflicts could be repackaged into local networks. And law enforcement agencies were still adapting to the reality that global political violence could manifest through domestic actors who held passports, jobs, and ordinary lives while maintaining secret ideological commitments beneath the surface. Airports like Montreal's were bustling symbols of modern mobility, places where families embraced at departure gates, where languages blended in announcements, and where thousands of pieces of luggage moved invisibly through conveyor systems, each bag indistinguishable from the next, a system built on trust and efficiency rather than suspicion. And it was precisely this system that made aviation both powerful and vulnerable. Because in an era before advanced explosive detection technologies became standard, the assumption was that security screenings at origin points were sufficient to guarantee safety in transit. Within this environment, intelligence agencies had begun to notice fragments of concerning information, scattered references to extremist discussions, travel patterns involving individuals loosely connected through ideological circles, and vague warnings that certain groups might be exploring retaliatory actions linked to overseas political events. But these signals were not yet unified into a coherent threat picture, and bureaucratic divisions between agencies in Canada and abroad meant that critical pieces of information often remained siloed, reviewed but not fully acted upon, filed but not urgently escalated. Meanwhile, within segments of the Sikh diaspora community, internal divisions were growing between those advocating peaceful political advocacy and those drawn toward more militant interpretations of justice, and figures like Talwinder Singh Parmar emerged within this fractured landscape as controversial and polarizing individuals, associated with Babar Khalsa, an organization that Canadian authorities would later classify as extremist, though at the time surveillance and intelligence assessments were still struggling to define its operational capacity and reach. Parmar himself would later be described in investigative records as a central ideological figure, someone whose influence extended beyond direct action into the realm of inspiration and coordination. Though the exact extent of his operational involvement in the Air India bombing would remain debated in legal and historical analysis for decades, reflecting the broader difficulty of attributing responsibility in covert, multi-layered conspiracies where direct evidence was scarce and much of the planning occurred in environments designed to avoid detection. Alongside him, Inderjit Singh Riyat, a mechanic and electrician by trade, would later become a critical focus of forensic investigation due to his technical involvement in explosive device construction. Though at the time of the events leading up to June 1985, he appeared in records not as a central figure, but as someone connected through associations that only later gained significance when placed into the broader evidentiary mosaic. In aviation infrastructure across Canada, baggage handling systems functioned with a level of routine precision that masked their vulnerability, as luggage moved from check-in counters to sorting facilities and onto aircraft holds with minimal human inspection once initial screening was complete, and it was into this system that explosive devices, concealed within ordinary suitcases, were introduced, exploiting assumptions about trust, routine, and the improbability of coordinated sabotage on commercial routes. What made the planning particularly insidious was not only the construction of the devices, but their synchronization with flight schedules spanning multiple countries, including Air India Flight 182 departing from Montreal and Air India Flight 301 linked to Tokyo, creating a networked attack designed to ensure maximum disruption and difficulty of immediate attribution. A strategy that would only become clear to investigators in hindsight as they reconstructed timelines across time zones and airport systems. In the days and weeks leading up to the bombing, ordinary life continued uninterrupted for passengers who would later board Flight 182, many of whom were engaged in routine activities such as packing luggage, confirming travel documents, and saying goodbye to family members at airport terminals filled with the familiar tension of long-distance travel, where anticipation and fatigue coexist in equal measure. And nothing in those moments suggested that their journey would end in catastrophe over the cold waters off Ireland. Within aviation security offices, the procedural environment at the time relied heavily on document checks and basic screening protocols, and although intelligence warnings did exist in fragmented form, the integration of those warnings into operational decisions was inconsistent, influenced by communication delays, jurisdictional boundaries, and the sheer volume of global travel data that had to be processed without modern digital systems capable of real-time cross-referencing. This gap between intelligence awareness and operational execution would later become one of the central themes of inquiries into the disaster, as investigators examined how known risks failed to translate into preventive action, and how systemic inertia allowed a coordinated act of violence to pass through multiple checkpoints undetected. In hindsight, the most haunting aspect of the prelude to Flight 182 is not a single missed signal, but the accumulation of small failures, each one seemingly insufficient on its own to justify drastic intervention, yet collectively forming the conditions under which a catastrophic breach became possible. As the aircraft taxied down the runway in Montreal and lifted into the morning sky, there was no visible indication that its cargo included instruments of destruction, no behavioral anomaly among passengers, no mechanical irregularity in the systems that kept it aloft, only the silent presence of concealed intent embedded within the baggage hold, waiting for a precise moment that would arrive far from any possibility of intervention. And in that sense, the stage for one of the deadliest aviation terror attacks in history had already been set long before the plane ever left the ground, shaped by years of political tension, fragmented intelligence, and a security architecture that had not yet been forced to imagine the full scope of what coordinated international terrorism could look like when carried inside the ordinary infrastructure of global travel. To understand the scale of what was lost on Flight 182, investigators and families alike had to begin not with the explosion, not with the wreckage, but with the lives that were quietly unfolding in homes, workplaces, and airport terminals across Canada and India in the days before the tragedy, because every seat on that aircraft represented a story that had weight, texture, and emotional gravity long before it became a name on a manifest or a statistic in an official report. Among those 329 passengers were families bound not only by blood but by migration itself, people who had built dual identities across continents, carrying the emotional architecture of Punjab while living in the modern urban landscapes of Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, where they worked, raised children, and navigated the complex balance between cultural heritage and assimilation. And in many cases, this flight was not just transportation but a bridge between worlds, a return to aging parents, a visit to ancestral villages, or a journey to fulfill obligations that had accumulated across years of separation. In the quiet neighborhoods of Canada, families prepared for departures in ways that seemed ordinary at the time, but would later become painfully symbolic in memory, folding clothes into suitcases, double-checking travel documents, and arranging rides to airports, unaware that these mundane rituals were the final gestures before irreversible loss. Each passenger carried their own private motivations, some traveling for weddings that would never take place, others returning from work assignments abroad, and many simply going home, a word that carried different meanings depending on which side of the ocean they had built their life. Yet all of them shared the same assumption that commercial aviation, despite its complexities, remained fundamentally safe, governed by systems of redundancy and oversight designed to protect human life even in the most routine circumstances. Among the passengers were children traveling with parents, elderly individuals returning to see family after years apart, and young professionals whose lives were still in the early stages of construction, their futures still open and undefined, now unknowingly compressed into the final hours before departure. For those who would later be identified through manifests and personal effects, investigators would piece together fragments of identity through passports, photographs, letters, and belongings. Recovered from the debris field, each item serving as a fragile link between a person who once existed in full life and the moment in which that life was suddenly erased. In the days following the disaster, families gathered at airports and community centers in a state of suspended disbelief, holding on to the hope that there had been some mistake, some miscommunication, some scenario in which their loved ones might still be found alive, because the absence of immediate clarity created a psychological space where denial could temporarily coexist with grief, and it was only as official confirmations began to arrive that the full weight of the loss began to settle. One of the most devastating aspects for families was the lack of physical closure, as much of the aircraft had disintegrated in midair and fallen into the Atlantic Ocean, making recovery efforts slow, fragmented, and emotionally taxing for those tasked with identifying remains, and for relatives who waited for news. That often came in incomplete and impersonal forms, such as partial identifications or confirmation that recovery was impossible. Among the victims were individuals whose lives reflected the diversity of the Sikh diaspora experience, including first-generation immigrants who had worked tirelessly to establish financial stability in Canada, second-generation children who were navigating hybrid identities, and elders who still maintained deep ties to villages in India, all of them bound together in death by the same catastrophic moment that ignored age, status, and intention. The emotional impact extended far beyond immediate families, reaching into entire communities where news of the disaster spread rapidly through word of mouth, radio broadcasts, and emerging television coverage, creating collective mourning rituals in gurdwaras and community halls where prayers were held not only for the dead, but for the impossible task of comprehending how such a tragedy could occur. In parallel, investigators began the difficult process of reconstructing victim identities, a task that required meticulous attention to passenger lists, seating charts, baggage tags, and personal records, often relying on dental records and DNA analysis in later stages of the investigation, as traditional identification methods were insufficient due to the severity of the explosion and subsequent crash into the ocean. Each reconstructed identity added another layer to the growing understanding that this was not an abstract disaster but a deeply human one, composed of individuals with relationships, routines, ambitions, and unresolved conversations left behind in the rush of departure. Among the victims were couples who had built lives across borders, parents who had spent years saving money for a single trip to see their children, and young people whose absence would alter the trajectory of entire families, creating voids that could not be filled by time or explanation. As the scale of the tragedy became clearer, media coverage began to shift from initial confusion to a more sustained examination of who the victims were. And in doing so, it revealed the emotional geography of diaspora life, where airports functioned as emotional thresholds between belonging and separation, and where each journey carried not only physical luggage, but also the accumulated weight of expectation, responsibility, and hope. For investigators, understanding the victims also meant understanding the context in which they lived, because the motivations behind the attack could not be separated from the communities it targeted, and this required careful navigation to avoid reducing individuals to symbols within a larger political narrative. Yet even as official processes attempted to categorize and document the dead, families experienced grief in intensely personal ways, marked by unanswered phone calls, unopened letters, and the persistent inability to perform final rites in traditional ways. Due to the absence of recovered bodies, which left many in a state of suspended mourning that would last for years. In this way, the story of Flight 182 is not only about how 329 people were killed in an instant over the Atlantic, but also about how those 329 lives continued to exist in memory, in documentation, and in the enduring absence felt within households that once expected return calls, return visits, and return embraces that would never come, transforming an ordinary international flight into a permanent rupture in the lives of thousands who were left behind to carry the weight of a journey that never reached its destination. The final hours of Air India Flight 182 did not unfold like a traditional aviation emergency, where warning signs escalate gradually and the crew has time to react, but instead collapsed into violence so sudden and absolute that it left no space for human response, no negotiation with fate, and no opportunity for the passengers or crew to even comprehend what was happening as they crossed the North Atlantic at cruising altitude. At that moment, the aircraft was a sealed world of ordinary behaviors, people sleeping in their seats, flight attendants moving quietly through aisles, overhead bins filled with luggage that had passed through multiple airports and handling systems. All of it functioning within the familiar rhythm of long-haul international travel, a rhythm built on predictability and trust. Beneath this surface of routine, however, an unseen mechanism had already been set into motion, a chain of events initiated long before the aircraft ever left Montreal, when baggage containing concealed explosive devices entered the airline's routing system and was transferred across international boundaries without interception, carried forward by the assumption that prior security checks had already ensured safety. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of approximately 31,000 feet over Irish airspace, there was nothing unusual reported by the cockpit crew. No mechanical malfunction, no turbulence severe enough to cause concern, and no communication from air traffic control suggesting danger. Yet inside the forward baggage compartment, conditions had already reached a critical threshold that would transform the flight from routine to catastrophic in an instant. At 8:13 a.m. local time, a powerful explosion detonated within the cargo hold, a blast of such intensity that it breached the structural integrity of the fuselage almost immediately, initiating a rapid decompression and structural failure that propagated through the aircraft faster than any human reaction could occur, tearing apart sections of the plane in midair and eliminating any possibility of controlled descent or emergency response. Within seconds, the aircraft ceased to exist as a single intact structure, and what had been a functioning commercial flight became a debris field scattered across a vast section of the Atlantic, falling toward the ocean in fragments that would later challenge recovery teams for months. There was no distress signal, no final transmission from the cockpit, because the nature of the explosion left no time for the pilots to activate emergency procedures or even register the source of the catastrophe. And in this silence, investigators would later find one of the most chilling aspects of the event: the absence of any human voice acknowledging the end. As the wreckage descended into the ocean, the impact scattered personal belongings, structural components, and human remains across a wide area of water, where currents and depth would complicate recovery efforts and obscure critical forensic evidence, forcing investigators to rely on fragmentary physical traces, such as recovered luggage pieces, seat fragments, and electronic components to reconstruct the final moments of the flight. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away in Tokyo Narita Airport, another event connected to the same network of explosive devices unfolded almost simultaneously, when a separate piece of luggage linked to the Air India system detonated within a baggage handling area, killing an airport worker, and revealing that the attack was not confined to a single aircraft, but was part of a coordinated, multi-location operation designed to exploit the interconnected nature of international aviation logistics. The timing of both explosions suggested precise synchronization, indicating that those responsible had carefully calculated flight schedules, baggage transfer points, and routing systems in order to ensure that devices would activate in different locations within a narrow temporal window, maximizing both casualties and investigative confusion. In the immediate aftermath of the Flight 182 explosion, air traffic controllers monitoring the region noticed the sudden disappearance of the aircraft from radar screens, an abrupt loss of signal that initially prompted uncertainty before confirmation began to emerge that a catastrophic event had occurred, though the scale and cause were not yet understood. Irish maritime authorities and search and rescue teams were quickly mobilized, deploying aircraft and ships to the area where radar contact had been lost. But the vastness of the ocean and the nature of the breakup meant that initial visual confirmation of wreckage took time, and when debris was finally located, it confirmed what radar data had already suggested. There would be no survivors. As recovery operations began, investigators faced the dual challenge of locating physical evidence in a maritime environment while also attempting to reconstruct a timeline of events that had occurred at cruising altitude, far beyond the reach of direct witnesses, relying instead on radar data, maintenance records, baggage tracking systems, and intelligence reports that were only gradually being connected into a coherent narrative. One of the earliest breakthroughs in understanding the nature of the disaster came from examining the pattern of structural failure, which indicated an internal explosion rather than external impact, or mechanical malfunction, and this conclusion immediately shifted the focus of the investigation from accident analysis to criminal inquiry, specifically the possibility of sabotage through explosive devices placed inside checked baggage. As forensic teams studied recovered fragments of the aircraft, they identified blast damage consistent with high-energy explosives located in the forward baggage compartment, and this physical evidence, combined with the simultaneous explosion in Tokyo, confirmed that the disaster was the result of a coordinated bombing operation targeting the Air India network. The realization that explosives had passed through multiple airport security systems without detection raised urgent questions about baggage screening procedures in Canada and the effectiveness of intelligence sharing between agencies responsible for monitoring potential threats. Within hours of the incident, investigators began mapping the baggage flow from origin points in Canada. Through connecting airports, attempting to identify where the explosive devices had been introduced into the system and how they had bypassed existing safeguards, a process that revealed gaps in communication between security agencies and highlighted the limitations of screening technologies of the era. As these technical findings emerged, attention also turned to the human dimension of the event, particularly the realization that the victims had no warning whatsoever, no indication that their flight had been compromised, and no opportunity to react, making the psychological impact on families and investigators even more profound, as they were forced to confront a form of violence that operated entirely outside the range of human perception until the moment of detonation. In the days that followed, as debris continued to be recovered from the Atlantic and brought to shore for analysis, the scope of the investigation expanded rapidly, involving multiple national agencies and becoming one of the largest international aviation crime investigations ever undertaken, driven by the urgent need not only to identify those responsible, but also to understand how a commercial aircraft could be transformed into a target of coordinated destruction without detection. What emerged from this early phase of the investigation was a stark realization that the disaster was not the result of a single point of failure, but a cascading breakdown across systems, technologies, and assumptions that had defined aviation security at the time, and within that breakdown lay the foundation for one of the most complex and consequential terrorism cases in modern history. When investigators began to piece together what remained of Air India Flight 182, they were not stepping into a conventional crime scene, but into something fragmented across ocean currents, international jurisdictions, and the shattered logic of aviation security, where every recovered object carried the weight of unanswered questions, and every missing fragment represented a gap in the story that might never be fully closed. The first confirmed discovery came not as a single coherent wreckage site but as scattered debris drifting and sinking across the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Ireland, where search vessels moved slowly through gray waters that seemed indifferent to the magnitude of the tragedy beneath them, retrieving twisted metal, torn insulation, fragments of seats, and personal belongings that had been transformed by explosive force into objects stripped of their original meaning. Each item brought ashore was logged with meticulous precision, photographed, and analyzed. Because at this stage of the investigation, even the smallest fragment could hold clues about the sequence of destruction, the location of the blast, and the internal dynamics of the aircraft at the moment it broke apart. Among the earliest confirmed findings were sections of fuselage bearing outward deformation consistent with an internal explosion, a critical detail that immediately shifted the investigative framework away from mechanical failure or pilot error and toward deliberate sabotage, forcing authorities to treat the crash not as an accident, but as a crime scene of unprecedented scale. As salvage teams expanded their search area, they faced the immense challenge of working in deep ocean conditions where visibility was limited, currents unpredictable, and debris dispersed over a wide radius, making recovery both physically demanding and emotionally draining, particularly for those who understood that each recovered piece might correspond to human lives lost in an instant of unimaginable violence. While maritime recovery operations continued, parallel efforts were underway in Canada, where investigators began reconstructing the aircraft's departure sequence from Montreal, examining passenger manifests, baggage handling logs, and security screening records to identify anomalies in the flow of luggage that might indicate how explosive devices entered the system. This process revealed that certain bags had been transferred between flights without being physically accompanied by the passengers they were registered to, a routine practice in international travel, but one that, in this case, created a vulnerability that would be exploited with catastrophic consequences. Attention quickly focused on the baggage reconciliation system, where investigators discovered discrepancies in how certain pieces of luggage were tracked through connecting flights, raising questions about whether warnings from intelligence agencies had been properly integrated into operational decision-making at the airport level. At the same time, forensic teams began analyzing recovered fragments of the aircraft's forward cargo hold, where the primary explosion had occurred, and the pattern of damage suggested a high-energy detonation originating within a suitcase or similar container, consistent with a concealed improvised explosive device. Chemical residue testing later confirmed the presence of explosive compounds, strengthening the conclusion that the aircraft had been deliberately targeted. As these findings accumulated, investigators also began reconstructing the final minutes of the flight using radar data, which showed Flight 182 maintaining a stable cruising altitude over Irish airspace before disappearing abruptly from tracking systems without any prior distress call, a detail that underscored the suddenness of the event and the inability of the crew to respond. The absence of any radio communication from the cockpit became one of the most haunting elements of the case, because it suggested that the explosion had occurred with such speed and force that the pilots were deprived of even a fraction of time needed to initiate emergency protocols. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, investigators examined the parallel explosion involving another piece of baggage linked to Air India operations, where a separate device detonated in a cargo handling area, killing a ground worker and confirming that the attack was not isolated but part of a coordinated multi-site operation designed to exploit the interconnected nature of international aviation logistics. This second explosion provided critical corroboration for the theory that multiple devices had been planted within the baggage system and timed to detonate at different points in the network, increasing both casualties and confusion among responding authorities. As investigators connected the two events, they began mapping the movement of luggage through multiple airports, identifying transfer points, screening checkpoints, and security handoffs where human oversight and procedural gaps could have allowed explosive devices to pass undetected. In Canada, this led to intense scrutiny of airport security protocols at the time, particularly the reliance on manual verification systems and the limited capacity of screening technology to detect non-metallic explosives concealed within densely packed luggage. As the technical investigation deepened, attention also turned to the human and organizational failures that may have contributed to the breach, including intelligence warnings that had reportedly flagged potential threats, but were not fully integrated into operational procedures, creating a dangerous disconnect between information and action. At the same time, families of victims began arriving at airports and community centers seeking answers, but were instead confronted with uncertainty, incomplete information, and the slow, painful process of identification that relied heavily on fragmented remains and personal effects recovered from the ocean. For many families, the absence of a complete body meant that grief could not follow its normal cultural or religious pathways, leaving them suspended between acceptance and denial, unable to perform final rites or achieve closure in the traditional sense. Investigators, meanwhile, faced their own emotional burden as they reviewed passenger lists and personal histories, knowing that each name represented a life interrupted without warning, and that behind every technical finding lay a human story that would never reach its intended destination. As the scope of the investigation expanded, it became clear that reconstructing the sequence of events would require unprecedented international cooperation, involving Canadian authorities, British Air Traffic Control, Irish Maritime Services, and intelligence agencies across multiple countries, all working to assemble fragments of evidence that spanned continents and systems. Yet even as the physical and technical reconstruction advanced, the deeper question of how such a coordinated attack could have succeeded within modern aviation infrastructure remained unresolved, casting a long shadow over every procedural review and every recovered piece of evidence. In this phase of the investigation, the crime scene was no longer confined to the wreckage in the Atlantic, but extended across airports, databases, and security systems, transforming Flight 182 into a case study in systemic vulnerability as much as a forensic tragedy, and setting the stage for a prolonged search not only for perpetrators, but for the failures that allowed the catastrophe to occur. As the investigation into the destruction of Air India Flight 182 moved beyond the initial shock of the explosion and into the long, grinding phase of suspect identification, investigators found themselves entering a landscape where evidence was fragmented, intelligence was incomplete, and every promising lead seemed to dissolve into ambiguity before it could solidify into a prosecutable truth. The early assumption that a coordinated act of terrorism lay behind the attack quickly narrowed the scope of inquiry, but it did not simplify it, because identifying responsibility meant navigating a complex web of ideological factions, diaspora politics, and clandestine networks operating across borders, each layer adding both potential explanation and further confusion. Attention first turned to the possibility that the attack had been carried out by extremist elements within the Sikh separatist movement, particularly groups operating in Canada during the 1980s who were believed to support the idea of an independent Khalistan and who had, according to intelligence reports, expressed hostility toward the Indian government following the 1984 military operation at the Golden Temple in Amritsar, an event that had become a powerful symbolic rupture within the Sikh diaspora and a rallying point for radicalization in certain circles. Within this context, investigators began mapping known organizations, focusing particularly on Babur Khalsa, a group that had been flagged by multiple agencies for its militant rhetoric and suspected involvement in violent activities, and whose leadership structure included individuals who were already under surveillance for unrelated threats. Among those names, Talwinder Singh Parmar emerged as a figure of significant interest, not because of direct forensic evidence linking him to the bombing in its earliest stages, but because of intelligence reports, witness statements, and associations that placed him in proximity to key logistical and ideological networks connected to extremist planning in Canada during the period leading up to the attack. However, proximity was not proof, and investigators quickly encountered the first major obstacle in building a legally viable case, which was the gap between intelligence gathered through surveillance or informants and admissible evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of a criminal trial. At the same time, attention shifted to another individual whose name would become central to the technical understanding of the bombing: Inderjit Singh Riyat, a mechanic and electrician with knowledge of explosive components and a history of association with individuals linked to extremist circles, whose skills in assembling devices placed him within the narrow category of people capable of constructing the type of improvised explosive devices believed to have been used in the attack. Investigators began reconstructing Riyat's movements, communications, and financial transactions in the months leading up to June 1985, searching for indications that he had purchased materials consistent with bomb-making or had engaged in suspicious testing activity, and while some circumstantial evidence suggested involvement in experimentation with explosive devices, the evidentiary trail remained incomplete, fragmented by time and the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. Complicating matters further was the discovery that the operation appeared to have been more sophisticated than a single-act deployment, suggesting coordination between multiple individuals responsible for different stages of the process, including acquisition of materials, assembly of devices, and insertion of luggage into the airline system without detection. This multi-layered structure meant that even identifying one participant did not automatically reveal the full network, and investigators found themselves repeatedly tracing connections that led to intermediaries who either refused to cooperate, provided inconsistent statements, or could not be reliably corroborated. As the investigation expanded, intelligence agencies also examined the possibility that informants within extremist circles had prior knowledge of the plot, but either failed to act decisively or were not able to communicate their information in time to prevent the attack, raising difficult questions about intelligence handling, communication breakdowns, and institutional accountability. Meanwhile, internal reviews within Canadian security agencies revealed that warnings about potential threats to Air India flights had been circulated in general terms prior to the bombing, but these warnings were not sufficiently specific or operationally actionable to trigger targeted interventions, a failure that would later become one of the most heavily criticized aspects of the entire case. Alongside these institutional failures, investigators also faced the challenge of witness reliability, as several individuals who initially provided statements later recanted or altered their accounts, sometimes due to fear of retaliation and sometimes due to the passage of time, which eroded the clarity of recollection. In one particularly significant line of inquiry, investigators explored whether individuals close to Parmar had been present during meetings where violent retaliation was discussed, but even when such meetings were alleged, proving what was said in private gatherings proved nearly impossible without corroborating physical or documentary evidence. At the same time, surveillance operations attempted to monitor suspected associates, but these efforts were constrained by legal thresholds and the difficulty of distinguishing genuine operational planning from political rhetoric, especially within a highly charged diaspora environment where political activism and radical ideology often overlapped in ways that blurred investigative boundaries. As months turned into years, the case began to reflect a deeper structural problem, where the scale of the conspiracy contrasted sharply with the limited number of individuals who could be definitively linked to actionable criminal conduct, creating a persistent gap between suspicion and prosecution. Investigators also faced increasing frustration as potential leads led to individuals who either died before they could be fully questioned or became unavailable due to relocation or lack of jurisdictional reach, further weakening the continuity of the investigative narrative. Despite these obstacles, the central theory of coordinated bombing remained intact, supported by forensic reconstruction of the explosion pattern, baggage routing anomalies, and the parallel Tokyo incident, which together formed a coherent operational framework, even if the human architecture behind it remained only partially visible. By the end of this phase of investigation, authorities had constructed a working hypothesis that identified key individuals and roles within the plot, but they had not yet achieved the level of evidentiary certainty required to bring comprehensive charges against the alleged masterminds, leaving the case suspended in a difficult space between intelligence assessment and criminal proof, where the outlines of responsibility were visible, but the final chain of accountability remained frustratingly incomplete. The breakthrough in the Air India Flight 182 investigation did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but rather as a slow convergence of technical evidence, intelligence reevaluation, and the re-examination of fragments that had existed in the case file for years without being fully understood in context. And it was only when investigators began to connect forensic reconstruction with behavioral patterns and logistical inconsistencies that the architecture of the plot started to emerge with unsettling clarity. One of the most significant turning points came from the detailed analysis of baggage handling systems across multiple airports involved in the Air India network, particularly the sequence of how unaccompanied luggage had been processed through Montreal, transferred through connecting hubs, and ultimately routed toward Flight 182, because investigators realized that the bombing device had not simply been placed on a passenger flight in isolation, but had been engineered to exploit weaknesses in international baggage transfer protocols, allowing it to move across borders without being physically accompanied by the individual who checked it in. This realization reframed the entire investigation, shifting focus from a single perpetrator boarding a plane to a coordinated logistical operation involving individuals who never intended to travel, but instead used the airline system itself as a delivery mechanism for destruction. As forensic experts reconstructed the timeline, they identified critical inconsistencies in baggage reconciliation records, including instances where luggage was loaded onto flights without corresponding passenger verification, a procedural failure that would later become one of the most heavily scrutinized aspects of aviation security reforms. At the same time, renewed attention was given to the technical composition of the explosive devices, and laboratory analysis confirmed that the bombs were constructed using improvised materials consistent with commercially available components that had been assembled in a way requiring both chemical knowledge and practical experimentation, reinforcing the conclusion that at least one individual involved possessed hands-on technical capability rather than purely ideological motivation. This is where Inderjit Singh Riyat's role became central, as investigators began to map his known activities against procurement patterns of explosive precursors, workshop access, and associations with individuals previously linked to extremist discussions, and although earlier attempts to prosecute him had been hindered by insufficient corroboration, the accumulation of circumstantial evidence over time created a stronger narrative of involvement in the physical construction phase of the devices. Parallel to this technical development, intelligence agencies revisited intercepted communications and informant reports that had been archived but not fully integrated into the original investigative framework, and in doing so they discovered patterns of association that had previously been dismissed as coincidental, but now appeared to reflect deliberate coordination among a small but ideologically aligned group. Within this refined analytical framework, Talwinder Singh Parmar's role was reassessed not only as a symbolic ideological leader, but as a potential operational coordinator whose influence extended into the planning stages of the attack, including the strategic selection of targets and the timing of the operation in relation to symbolic anniversaries tied to political grievances. However, even as the narrative of involvement became more coherent, the evidentiary threshold required for prosecution remained high, and investigators struggled with the fundamental problem that much of the intelligence pointing toward leadership responsibility originated from sources that could not be fully disclosed in court without compromising methods or endangering informants, creating a tension between operational secrecy and judicial transparency. A further critical breakthrough came from the re-examination of the Tokyo Narita incident, where a second explosive device associated with Air India baggage had detonated prematurely, killing an airport worker and providing investigators with a rare opportunity to compare blast signatures, residue composition, and device construction under controlled forensic conditions, allowing them to establish a link between the two bombs and confirm that they were part of a coordinated dual-device strategy intended to maximize casualties across different phases of the Air India flight network. This discovery eliminated any remaining doubt that the Montreal explosion was an isolated act and instead confirmed a synchronized operation involving at least two devices and multiple stages of execution. As these findings converged, investigators began constructing a prosecutorial theory that divided responsibility into distinct roles, identifying those who conceived the ideological justification, those who financed or facilitated logistics, and those who physically assembled the explosive devices. And it was within this framework that the case against Riyat became more concrete, as physical evidence tied to his activities aligned with the known technical requirements of the bomb construction process. Yet even as the structure of the case solidified, the investigation faced one final major challenge in translating this framework into courtroom success, because key figures believed to be central to the planning phase either could not be located, were deceased, or were protected by insufficient admissible evidence, leaving prosecutors with a partial but not complete chain of accountability. Nonetheless, the breakthrough phase fundamentally transformed the case from an unsolved mass casualty event into a structured narrative of coordinated terrorism, providing for the first time a coherent explanation of how the attack was conceived, executed, and facilitated, even if full legal closure remained elusive for many of the victims' families. The courtroom phase of the Air India Flight 182 case unfolded not as a single dramatic moment of resolution, but as a prolonged struggle between memory, forensic reconstruction, and the legal limits of accountability, where the weight of 329 deaths had to be translated into evidence that could survive cross-examination, procedural scrutiny, and the rigid structure of criminal law. By the time proceedings began in earnest years after the bombing, the case had already become one of the most complex and controversial terrorism prosecutions in Canadian history, not only because of the scale of the attack, but because of the fractured nature of the evidence, much of which had been collected across multiple jurisdictions over decades and under conditions that made continuity difficult to preserve. Prosecutors entered the courtroom with a theory built on layered reconstruction, presenting the bombing as a coordinated act involving ideological motivation, logistical execution, and technical construction of explosive devices, but proving each layer beyond reasonable doubt required bridging gaps that time had widened rather than closed. The central focus of prosecution narrowed significantly over time, ultimately resulting in charges that concentrated on Inderjit Singh Riyat, whose alleged role in assembling the explosive devices became the most directly supportable element of the case, supported by forensic analysis, circumstantial connections, and reconstructed timelines of activity that placed him in proximity to materials and knowledge necessary for bomb construction. In court, the evidence presented against him centered on the technical consistency between recovered explosive residue and known materials he had access to, as well as testimony describing experiments and handling of explosive components, all of which painted a picture of involvement in the physical creation of the devices used in both the Air India Flight 182 and Tokyo Narita explosions. However, even this technically grounded portion of the case was not straightforward, as defense arguments challenged the reliability of witness recollections, the chain of custody for certain pieces of evidence, and the interpretation of forensic conclusions drawn years after the fact. Meanwhile, the broader alleged conspiracy involving ideological leadership and coordination faced far greater challenges in court, as many of the individuals identified in investigative phases were never successfully prosecuted, either due to lack of admissible evidence, jurisdictional limitations, or their absence from the legal process entirely, leaving a significant portion of the narrative acknowledged in investigative reports, but not fully tested in adversarial proceedings. This gap between investigative certainty and legal conviction became one of the defining tensions of the case, as prosecutors were forced to acknowledge that while the structure of the conspiracy appeared coherent in intelligence and forensic synthesis, the courtroom demanded a narrower standard of proof that could not always accommodate intelligence-derived conclusions. As testimony unfolded, families of victims attended proceedings in large numbers, their presence serving as a constant reminder that behind every procedural debate and evidentiary challenge lay an irreversible human loss. And their emotional reactions often contrasted sharply with the clinical language of forensic analysis being presented. In court, witnesses described not only technical findings but also the human impact of the explosion, including the moment of impact, the recovery of personal belongings, and the identification process that followed, each account reinforcing the reality that the case was not abstract but rooted in lives abruptly ended over the Atlantic Ocean. After extensive proceedings, Riat was ultimately convicted for his role in assisting the construction of the bombs, receiving a lengthy prison sentence that reflected the seriousness of his involvement in the technical execution of the attack. Yet even this outcome did not resolve the broader question of accountability for the full scope of the conspiracy, as the individuals believed to have orchestrated or directed the operation were never fully brought before a court of law. This partial resolution left the legal outcome structurally incomplete, with conviction achieved for a key operational participant, but without judicial closure for the leadership dimension of the attack, creating a lingering sense of unfinished justice within both legal and public discourse. Appeals, reviews, and subsequent inquiries continued to examine the handling of evidence, intelligence sharing, and prosecutorial strategy, often highlighting systemic challenges that had complicated the path to conviction, including interagency communication failures and the limitations of prosecuting transnational conspiracies within domestic legal frameworks. Despite these complexities, the courtroom phase did establish a legally recognized foundation for understanding the bombing as an act of coordinated terrorism rather than an accident or isolated criminal act, and in doing so it formally acknowledged the existence of intent, planning, and execution behind one of the deadliest aviation attacks in history. Yet for many families, the verdicts, while significant, represented only a partial form of closure, as the absence of full accountability for all participants left unresolved emotional and moral questions that continued to extend far beyond the boundaries of the courtroom, reinforcing the sense that justice, in this case, was achieved in fragments rather than in completion. The aftermath of Air India Flight 182 did not end with the final verdicts or the conclusion of legal proceedings, but instead extended across decades as an enduring presence in the lives of families, investigators, and an entire nation forced to confront the consequences of a failure that was at once technical, political, and profoundly human. In the immediate years following the disaster, grief manifested not only as private mourning, but as a collective reckoning within Canada, where the scale of the tragedy made it impossible to treat the event as an isolated act of foreign terrorism disconnected from domestic responsibility, because the attack had been launched through systems operating within Canadian jurisdiction, exposing vulnerabilities that demanded reflection and reform. For the families of the 329 victims, many of whom had boardings rooted in migration, family reunification, and cultural return journeys, the absence of full physical remains complicated the grieving process in ways that conventional mourning rituals could not fully address, leaving many suspended between memory and uncertainty, holding on to fragments of belongings recovered from the ocean as tangible links to lives that had vanished without warning. Memorials were eventually established in cities across Canada, including Toronto, Vancouver, and Ottawa, each designed not only as a space of remembrance, but as a physical acknowledgement that the victims were part of the national fabric, and that their loss represented a collective wound rather than an isolated statistic. These memorials became sites where anniversaries were observed with solemn ceremonies, where names were read aloud, and where silence itself carried the weight of what words could not fully express, reinforcing the idea that remembrance was not a passive act but an ongoing responsibility. Over time, the case also prompted deep institutional reflection within Canadian aviation security and intelligence agencies, leading to reforms in baggage screening procedures, improvements in interagency communication protocols, and a reevaluation of how intelligence warnings were processed and acted upon, particularly when dealing with threats that cross domestic and international boundaries. Inquiries and commissions established in the aftermath examined not only the technical failures that allowed explosive devices to be loaded onto aircraft, but also the organizational culture that contributed to delayed responses. fragmented information sharing, and the underestimation of credible threats. These investigations revealed a pattern of systemic breakdowns rather than a single point of failure, showing how multiple small oversights, when combined, created the conditions for catastrophic consequence. Politically and socially, the bombing also had a lasting impact on Canada's multicultural landscape, particularly within the Sikh community, which found itself caught between mourning the victims and facing increased scrutiny and suspicion in the wake of the attack, a dynamic that introduced tensions around identity, belonging, and collective responsibility that persisted long after the legal case concluded. Many community leaders worked to separate the actions of extremist individuals from the broader Sikh population, emphasizing that violence rooted in political extremism did not represent the beliefs of the community as a whole. Yet the shadow of the bombing continued to influence public perception for years, illustrating how acts of terrorism can ripple outward far beyond their immediate targets. For investigators who worked on the case, the aftermath brought a different kind of burden, as the incomplete nature of legal accountability meant that many who had dedicated years of their careers to the investigation were left with a sense of unresolved purpose, knowing that while significant progress had been made in understanding the mechanics and partial execution of the plot, the full network of responsibility had never been entirely exposed within a courtroom. The passage of time did not erase the case from institutional memory, but instead transformed it into a reference point for aviation security policy, counterterrorism strategy, and crisis response planning, often cited in training and review processes as a reminder of how assumptions about safety can be undermined by coordinated exploitation of systemic weaknesses. In public discourse, the disaster came to symbolize not only the consequences of extremism, but also the cost of delayed action and fragmented intelligence, reinforcing the importance of proactive threat assessment and interagency cooperation in preventing similar tragedies. Yet beyond policy and procedure, the most enduring legacy remained deeply personal, carried by families who continued to mark anniversaries not as historical events, but as intimate moments of loss that never fully receded, where time did not close the wound but instead reshaped its form. In this sense, Air India Flight 182 became more than a case study in terrorism or aviation security failure, evolving instead into a permanent reminder of how quickly ordinary systems can be transformed into instruments of irreversible destruction when warning signs are missed or not fully acted upon. Even today, the memorial ceremonies and continued reflections serve not as closure, but as acknowledgement that some events remain part of living memory, shaping how nations understand responsibility, vulnerability, and the fragile trust that underpins global travel, leaving behind a legacy defined not only by what was lost in the skies over Ireland, but by everything that followed on the ground in the years and decades that came after. The meaning of Air India Flight 182 extends far beyond the physical destruction of an aircraft or even the legal outcomes that followed, because what remains most deeply is the way the case forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that modern systems, no matter how advanced they appear, are still vulnerable to intent that is organized, patient, and willing to exploit the smallest gaps in coordination and oversight. This was not a tragedy born from mechanical failure or random chance, but from a convergence of ideology, logistics, and human decision-making, where each step in the chain functioned in isolation but failed catastrophically when viewed as a whole, revealing how complexity itself can become a weakness when accountability is fragmented across institutions and borders. At its core, the bombing of Flight 182 is a study in how extremism can translate abstract grievance into precise operational planning, transforming political anger into physical destruction that moves through ordinary systems like baggage handling and flight scheduling, unnoticed until it is too late to intervene. Yet the deeper lesson is not only about those who carried out the attack, but also about the environment that allowed critical warnings to be diluted, delayed, or misunderstood, demonstrating that failures in communication can be as consequential as malicious intent when the stakes are measured in hundreds of lives. For the families of the victims, however, such analytical conclusions can never fully contain the emotional reality of loss, because no explanation, no matter how detailed or carefully constructed, can restore the absence left behind in homes, birthdays, and futures that were abruptly erased in the skies over the Atlantic. Their grief has evolved over time, not disappearing but changing shape, becoming something carried rather than resolved, something that is revisited every year through memorials, photographs, and names spoken aloud in ceremonies that serve as both remembrance and resistance against forgetting. In this way, the act of remembering becomes a form of justice in itself, especially in a case where legal accountability never fully encompassed every layer of responsibility, leaving parts of the story permanently outside the reach of courtrooms and verdicts. The case also endures as a defining moment in aviation security history, shaping how governments and agencies now approach threat detection, intelligence sharing, and the integration of warning systems, with reforms designed specifically to prevent the kinds of procedural breakdowns that allowed suspicious luggage to move through international networks without intervention. But even these systemic improvements carry the implicit acknowledgement that absolute security is unattainable, and that prevention depends not only on technology, but on human judgment, communication, and the willingness to act decisively on incomplete information within Canada's national consciousness. Flight 182 occupies a complex place, simultaneously remembered as the deadliest aviation disaster involving Canadian citizens, and as a case that exposed uncomfortable truths about institutional readiness, multicultural tensions, and the consequences of underestimating ideological violence emerging within domestic borders. Over time, public understanding of the case has shifted away from simplistic narratives toward a more nuanced recognition of its layered causes, where personal choices, organizational failures, and geopolitical grievances intersected in ways that resisted easy explanation. Still, for those closest to the victims, the academic framing of the tragedy can never replace the intimate reality of absence, where a phone call that never came or a seat that remains empty carries more meaning than any investigative report ever could. In reflecting on the legacy of Air India Flight 182, what becomes clear is that its significance lies not only in the scale of destruction, but in the questions it continues to raise about responsibility, prevention, and the limits of justice when crimes are designed to operate across borders and through systems that were never built to anticipate such deliberate exploitation. It is a reminder that security is not a fixed condition, but a continuous process of vigilance, adaptation, and learning, and that even then, certainty can never be guaranteed. Ultimately, the story does not conclude with resolution but with endurance, as memory persists where closure cannot fully reach, and the voices of those lost remain present not through absence alone, but through the ongoing effort to understand what happened and why, ensuring that the flight's final moments over Ireland are not forgotten as a statistic, but remembered as a human tragedy that reshaped laws, institutions, and the collective awareness of how fragile safety can be in a connected world. If we look back at Air India Flight 182 with the distance of time, what becomes most striking is not only the violence of the event itself, but the long shadow it cast over everything that followed. Because the explosion in the sky over the Atlantic was only the beginning of a much longer story that unfolded on the ground in institutions, courtrooms, homes, and communities that were forced to carry its weight for decades. In many ways, the investigation became as historic as the crime, not because it reached a clean or fully satisfying conclusion, but because it exposed the limits of what justice systems can achieve when faced with transnational conspiracies that move faster than bureaucracy, intelligence sharing, and legal coordination can respond. Every stage of the case revealed a different kind of failure or limitation, from missed warnings in the early phase to fragmented investigative responses, to the difficulty of translating intelligence into admissible evidence, and finally to the courtroom reality where only a fraction of the broader alleged network could be legally addressed. Yet even within those constraints, the case forced Canada to confront uncomfortable questions about how seriously threats are taken when they originate from within diaspora communities, and how easily early signals of danger can be minimized when they do not fit existing expectations of risk. This tension between perception and reality became one of the most important lessons of the entire tragedy, because it showed that security failures are rarely the result of a single mistake, but instead emerge from patterns of hesitation, miscommunication, and underestimation. For the families, however, these systemic lessons exist in a separate emotional dimension, where the abstract language of policy reform cannot touch the reality of absence that defines every anniversary, every memorial, and every private moment of remembrance. Many of them have lived through decades not defined by closure but by adaptation, learning how to carry grief that does not diminish but instead changes shape as time passes, becoming quieter but no less present, The names of the victims, read aloud each year, serve as a reminder that behind every investigative report and legal summary were individuals with plans, relationships, and futures that extended far beyond the moment the aircraft disintegrated. At the same time, the case also became a defining moment in the evolution of aviation. Security worldwide, influencing how baggage systems are monitored, how intelligence alerts are prioritized, and how interagency communication is structured to prevent critical information from being lost in procedural gaps. These reforms represent progress, but they also carry an implicit acknowledgement that no system can ever be completely immune to deliberate exploitation, especially when intent is adaptive and willing to study weaknesses over time, within law enforcement and intelligence. Communities, Air India 182 is often studied not only as a failure of prevention, but as a case study in complexity, showing how multiple small breakdowns can align into catastrophic consequence when viewed in hindsight, even if none of them individually appear decisive in the moment. And yet, perhaps the most enduring aspect of the case is its unfinished emotional architecture. The sense that while parts of the story were legally resolved, the broader narrative of accountability remains incomplete, leaving space for continued reflection, debate, and interpretation. In that sense, the legacy of Flight 182 is not static but ongoing, shaped each year by new generations who learn about it not as a distant historical footnote, but as a foundational example of how global systems can fail when vigilance falters. Ultimately, what remains is not only the memory of what was destroyed in the air, but the continuing effort on the ground to understand, prevent, and remember, ensuring that the tragedy is not reduced to numbers or procedures, but preserved as a human story that still speaks to the responsibility shared by institutions, communities, and individuals to recognize warning signs before they become irreversible consequences. In the final reflection on Air India Flight 182, what lingers most powerfully is the understanding that this was never just a moment of catastrophe frozen in time, but rather a fracture point that continued to echo through decades of policy, memory, and human emotion, reshaping how an entire nation understood vulnerability in an interconnected world. The aircraft itself vanished in seconds over the Atlantic, yet the consequences unfolded slowly, layer by layer, as investigators pieced together fragments of evidence, as families learned to live with absence, and as institutions were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that multiple safeguards had failed at once. This layered aftermath is what gives the case its enduring weight, because it resists simplification, refusing to settle into a single narrative of cause and effect, instead revealing a web of decisions, oversights, and intentions that intersected in ways no one fully anticipated until it was too late. For Canada, the tragedy became a defining test of its security systems and its ability to respond to threats that do not respect borders, forcing a long period of internal examination that exposed weaknesses not only in aviation procedures, but also in intelligence coordination and administrative responsiveness, where warnings existed but did not translate into decisive action. Yet beyond institutional analysis, the most profound impact remains human, carried in the silence of families who measure time not in years but in the absence of voices, birthdays, and shared futures that were permanently interrupted. Each memorial that stands in Toronto, Vancouver, or Ottawa is not merely a marker of historical remembrance, but a physical acknowledgement that grief does not conclude with official reports or court decisions, and that justice in its legal form does not always align with emotional resolution. Over time, the story of Flight 182 has also become a cautionary reference point in global aviation. Security, shaping protocols, influencing training programs, and reinforcing the necessity of treating even fragmented intelligence as potentially significant when lives are at stake, because the cost of dismissal can be irreversible. However, even as systems have evolved and safeguards have strengthened, the case continues to serve as a reminder that absolute prevention is an unattainable ideal, and that security is always a balance between vigilance, resources, and human judgment under uncertainty. What makes the tragedy especially enduring in public memory is not only its scale, but the way it exposed the fragile interface between ordinary travel and extraordinary intent, where everyday processes like baggage handling became the pathway for devastation. In reflecting on its legacy, it becomes clear that Air India Flight 182 is not confined to the past, but remains active in the present through policy, remembrance, and the ongoing effort to understand how such a failure could occur, ensuring that the lessons extracted from it are not static conclusions, but living principles carried forward into future decision-making. Ultimately, the story ends where it began, with lives abruptly cut short in a moment of silence over the ocean. But everything that followed continues to speak, reminding us that behind every system, every investigation, and every reform are human lives whose absence defines the true meaning of the tragedy, and whose memory ensures that the event is never reduced to history alone, but remains a lasting call for awareness, responsibility, and care. Extending the story beyond its structured conclusion, what emerges in the continuing shadow of Air India Flight 182 is not a new chapter of events, but a deeper excavation into everything that remained unresolved beneath the official record, where time did not bring clarity, so much as it exposed additional layers of complexity that had been invisible in the immediate aftermath. Years after convictions were handed down and investigative reports were finalized, the case continued to generate debate within legal, intelligence, and academic circles, not because the core facts of the bombing were in dispute, but because the interpretation of responsibility, accountability, and institutional failure remained deeply contested, creating a narrative that refused to settle into a single authoritative version. One of the most persistent points of discussion centered on the gap between intelligence knowledge and prosecutable evidence, where agencies had accumulated warnings, associations, and surveillance data that suggested a coordinated threat environment, yet struggled to convert that information into courtroom-ready proof that could withstand the rigorous standards of criminal law, revealing a structural tension between prevention and prosecution that would later become a defining issue in counterterrorism policy debates. At the same time, the long-term handling of informants and intelligence sources became a subject of scrutiny, as questions were raised about whether earlier, more decisive action could have disrupted planning stages of the operation, or whether institutional caution and jurisdictional fragmentation had allowed critical signals to dissipate across agencies without triggering intervention. This retrospective analysis did not change the outcome of the case, but it reshaped how it was understood within professional communities, transforming it from a single tragic event into a case study in systemic vulnerability, where the failure was distributed rather than isolated, embedded in communication protocols, administrative thresholds, and interagency trust structures that were not designed to respond to coordinated transnational threats of this nature. Alongside institutional reflection, there was also a growing scholarly effort to examine the psychological and ideological pathways that lead individuals into participation in extremist violence, not as a means of excusing responsibility, but as a way of understanding how political grievance, identity fragmentation, and group reinforcement can converge into operational intent, producing environments where violence is rationalized as necessity rather than choice. In this broader analysis, the Air India case became a reference point for how diaspora politics, historical trauma, and organizational ideology can interact in ways that are difficult to detect through conventional security frameworks, particularly when activities are dispersed across communities and concealed within ordinary social and logistical networks. Meanwhile, within public memory, the case continued to evolve as commemorations and memorials reinforced its presence in national consciousness, ensuring that it was not reduced to a closed historical file, but remained an active reminder of the consequences of systemic failure, where each anniversary served not only as remembrance of lives lost, but also as a reflection on what had been learned and what still remained vulnerable. For families, however, these analytical frameworks existed in parallel to lived grief, which did not diminish with time, but instead became a stable part of identity, carried forward through generations who learned about the tragedy not as an abstract historical event, but as a defining absence within their family narratives. In this sense, the aftermath of Flight 182 extends far beyond its legal resolution or investigative closure, continuing instead as a layered legacy of memory, reform, and unresolved inquiry, where justice achieved in court represents only one dimension of a much larger and more complex reckoning that continues to inform how societies think about security, responsibility, and the fragile systems that connect global movement with human vulnerability. What remains after decades of reflection on Air India Flight 182 is not simply a case that was investigated, prosecuted, and archived, but a living reminder of how fragile the boundaries are between knowledge and action, between warning and prevention, and between what is known inside institutions and what is ultimately proven in court. Over time, As official inquiries settled into historical documents and courtroom records became fixed points of reference, the case continued to circulate in a different space altogether, one shaped by policy debates, academic analysis, and the quiet persistence of families who never stopped revisiting the moment their lives were permanently divided into before and after. In this space, the bombing is no longer treated as a single event, but as a convergence point where multiple failures aligned, where intelligence existed but did not fully converge, where operational opportunity was recognized too late, and where procedural boundaries prevented decisive intervention, even as risk indicators accumulated across different agencies and jurisdictions. This layered structure of failure has made the case a permanent subject of study in counterterrorism training, not because it offers a simple lesson, but because it offers an uncomfortable truth that even when warning signs exist, systems built on compartmentalization and procedural caution can still fail to act in time. At the same time, the human dimension of the tragedy continues to resist institutional framing, because for the families of the 329 victims, the event is not something that can be revisited as analysis alone, but something that remains present in absence, in anniversaries marked by silence, and in personal histories that were permanently interrupted mid-sentence. Over the years, memorials have become more than symbolic structures, functioning instead as recurring points of collective return where memory is actively maintained, where names are spoken aloud not as data but as people, and where grief is shared across generations who did not experience the original moment but inherit its emotional weight. What makes the legacy of Flight 182 particularly enduring is that it exists simultaneously in two timelines, one governed by institutional learning, reform, and procedural improvement, and another governed by personal loss that does not evolve toward resolution, but instead stabilizes into permanence, reshaping identity rather than concluding it, even as aviation security has advanced significantly since the tragedy, incorporating more sophisticated screening technologies, improved intelligence coordination, and more aggressive threat assessment frameworks. The underlying lesson remains unchanged: that systems designed for safety are only as strong as their ability to interpret fragmented information under uncertainty and act before clarity fully arrives. In the end, the story does not close so much as it continues to echo, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a reality that has already been understood in its essential form, yet continues to demand attention, because understanding alone was never enough to prevent it, and remembering alone is what ensures that its lessons remain active rather than forgotten. In the long aftermath of Air India Flight 182, one of the most difficult realizations for investigators, policymakers, and families alike was that closure is not a single moment that arrives when a case is solved, but a fragmented process that unfolds unevenly across different groups of people, often never fully synchronizing between legal resolution, institutional learning, and personal grief. Even after convictions were secured and official reports were published, the question of whether justice had truly been achieved remained unsettled in public discourse, not because the core responsibility for the bombing was unclear, but because the broader network of accountability and the failures that allowed the attack to occur were never fully addressed in a way that felt proportionate to the scale of the tragedy. This gap between legal outcome and emotional justice became a defining feature of the case's legacy, shaping how it is remembered not only as an act of terrorism, but as an example of how modern systems can struggle to translate catastrophic loss into meaningful accountability. Within government and security institutions, the case gradually evolved into a foundational reference point, cited in discussions about intelligence integration, interagency coordination, and the dangers of compartmentalized information flows where critical signals can exist in isolation without triggering collective action. Training programs and policy reforms often reference the tragedy, not as an anomaly but as a warning about structural vulnerability, emphasizing that the failure was not the result of a single oversight, but the cumulative effect of multiple small breakdowns across different points of responsibility. Meanwhile, in the public consciousness, the event has taken on a more symbolic role over time, representing both the devastating consequences of extremist violence and the equally devastating consequences of institutional hesitation, creating a dual narrative, where accountability is distributed across both intent and inaction. For the families of the victims, however, these analytical frameworks remain secondary to lived experience, where memory is not structured around policy lessons or investigative findings but around absence, where birthdays are marked by silence, and where the passage of time does not diminish loss but simply changes its texture. What endures most powerfully is not the technical detail of how the attack was carried out, but the human reality of what was taken, the sudden disappearance of ordinary lives mid-journey, and the permanent reshaping of entire family trees that continue forward without branches that were expected to grow. In this way, the legacy of Flight 182 exists in parallel dimensions, one formal and institutional, focused on reform and prevention, and one deeply personal, focused on memory and absence. And these two dimensions rarely align in how they measure resolution. Even decades later, the case continues to be revisited not because it is unresolved in a legal sense, but because it remains unresolved in a moral and emotional sense, where the scale of loss resists final interpretation. And so the story persists, not as an open investigation, but as an enduring reminder that the consequences of a single coordinated act can extend far beyond the moment it occurs, shaping laws, systems, and human lives for generations that had no connection to the original event except through its aftermath, ensuring that Air India Flight 182 remains not just a chapter in aviation history, but a permanent point of reflection on vulnerability, responsibility, and the limits of prevention in an imperfect world. In the years following the Air India Flight 182 disaster, one of the most profound shifts in how the case was understood came not from new evidence or courtroom developments, but from a gradual change in how societies process large-scale tragedies that involve both political violence and systemic failure. Over time, the case became less about the immediate mechanics of the bombing itself and more about the long shadow it cast over institutional trust, particularly in how intelligence agencies communicate, how governments respond to warnings, and how public inquiries attempt to reconstruct events that were never fully visible in real time. This evolution in perspective revealed an uncomfortable truth that the most consequential failures are often not dramatic or singular, but dispersed across multiple decisions that, when viewed individually, appear justifiable, yet when combined, produce catastrophic outcomes. In this sense, Air India Flight 182 has come to function as a case study. In the limits of hindsight, demonstrating how clarity after the fact can create an illusion of simplicity that did not exist in the moment of decision-making. For policymakers, the tragedy continues to be referenced as a benchmark for evaluating risk communication, particularly in scenarios where intelligence is incomplete, fragmented, or politically sensitive, and where acting too late can be as consequential as acting too hastily. At the same time, for the families and communities affected, these institutional reflections exist in parallel to a far more personal reality that does not conform to analytical frameworks, where memory is not organized around timelines or reports but around emotional rupture, where the absence of loved ones is not an abstract consequence, but a daily presence that reshapes ordinary life in subtle and persistent ways. Over the decades, commemorations have become increasingly important not because they resolve grief, but because they provide a structured space for it to exist collectively, transforming private loss into shared remembrance while acknowledging that no formal conclusion can fully encompass what was taken. What makes this case particularly enduring is that it resists final categorization, existing simultaneously as a criminal act, a political act, and an institutional failure. Each interpretation capturing only a portion of the truth while leaving other dimensions unresolved. Even now, discussions about the tragedy often return to the same central tension between knowledge and action, between what was known before the event and what was done in response, and between the aspiration of absolute security and the reality of imperfect systems operating under uncertainty. In the end, Air India Flight 182 remains a fixed point in the history of aviation and counterterrorism, not because it can be neatly explained, but because it cannot, and because its most important lesson is not about certainty, but about the enduring cost of uncertainty when it is left unresolved.